This is Work From Home, the show that helps you stay connected, productive, and sane while working remotely. I'm Harry.
And I'm Alex.
And this week is Loneliness Awareness Week, which in the throes of a global pandemic seems like a really important topic that actually doesn't seem to get covered an awful lot. I think there are a lot of people, I think it's easy to sort of go about your life in your bubble and forget what the experiences other people are like. And I think there's many, many people that are affected in lots of adverse ways by lockdown and social distancing. But I think loneliness is one of those things that's often overlooked and not thought about. So we thought it'd be worth spending a couple of episodes this week talking about some information we found about loneliness. The first one, we're going to talk today about a couple of articles we found that kind of highlight some of the issues around loneliness that you might not have thought of. And then later in the week, we're going to look at sort of ways that you can tackle loneliness. So the first article we're going to look at is in The Guardian, and it's about young people and the loneliness that they're experiencing, which is actually something I wasn't expecting.
No, this is pretty interesting because I suppose you don't necessarily think of the young people being the lonely ones in society, but you don't have that avenue of high school or school to go out and actually interact with people.
Yeah, I guess so. Because when I saw these headlines, my initial reaction was, you know, the over 70s or the 65, the retired people who already there's probably a certain percentage of them who are already feeling lonely. But I thought this would sort of, you know, make that exponentially worse because, you know, their children or grandchildren or whatever can't come to visit. So
I suppose it's whatever you're used to. Like my youngest sister's in high school, and because they're now all doing their classes remotely, she's spending a huge amount of her time just doing schoolwork. But there's none of that interaction in person with her friends to go along with it. So it's almost like she has a job. You know, she gets up and does the 9 till 5 remotely in school, but there's none of the, you know, I think probably one of the most, if not the most important parts is actually socializing and learning how to be a person among other people.
yeah, it's funny. I've thought about that with our son, who's only one, so, you know, less developed in terms of his social capacity. But that's exactly what I was worrying about. You know, like he's a young kid. He's learning about socializing. He's learning about meeting other people, and lockdown is sort of restraining that and not allowing that to happen. I imagine that's, you know, even worse if you're 15, 16 and trying to get to grips with who you are as a person, and socializing is just a really important, I don't know, I'm going to make it sound weird. It's like a really important skill to hone, but it is like you're still learning, you know, who you are and what your place is in the world. So I guess to just be thrown out by yourself is probably a bit difficult.
Yeah, and one of the graphs here is kind of highlights that, what we were saying, this idea that it's, I suppose it's lockdown relative to what you're used to. And one of the graphs in this article says that there's about 2.6 million people who put themselves down in the column of feeling often or always lonely. And that number apparently hasn't increased much at all with the onset of lockdown. But it's this group of people who are referred to as lockdown lonely, which is 7.4 million new people who say that they are feeling lonely as a result of lockdown, which surely a significant number of these will be, you know, the people in school and high school who are used to socializing but don't really get it anymore.
I mean, that's incredible, isn't it? That's almost 10% of the population.
We have another article here, which is again from The Guardian, but rather than focusing on young people, 16 to 24-year-olds, it's about how a third of UK women are suffering from lockdown loneliness. And this is an interesting disparity, the same as the young people. I think it might just be because we're hopelessly uninformed that all of this is interesting.
It is, really. It really is. And I think that's why it's worth talking about it, because it's just like something that I haven't even thought about, really. And it turns out it's a massive, massive issue. So I think it's really, really important. So the article mentions that more than a third of women, so 34%, said they now sometimes felt lonely, and 11% said they often felt lonely. Whereas among men, 23% were sometimes lonely and only 6% were often lonely. So quite a big difference.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that this article puts forward as sort of accounting for this difference is that women are more likely to have lost their jobs over the past 3 months or so. And part of that could be down to women more often are in part-time roles rather than full-time roles, and a lot of those have been cut since lockdown, either furloughed or gone completely. And one thing that I'd add is I was watching, there's a coffee morning on loneliness yesterday, which is a whole bunch of people from different loneliness related charities. And one of the things they were talking about was that you don't have to be physically alone to feel lonely. It is entirely possible to feel lonely amongst other people.
Yeah.
It could be something personal to you, that you could live in a household with other people and still feel lonely.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that makes total sense. And it does make sense that if you've been furloughed or made redundant, that you're not having those daily, video calls with your team or whatever, that I can absolutely see that contributing to a feeling of isolation and loneliness. And also, as you're saying, kind of to your point, I think it would be very possible. And again, I'd love to hear what listeners of this podcast think, but that while working from home, I imagine it's incredibly possible to feel lonely and isolated when you've gone from physically interacting with people in the office, even if you haven't been furloughed or you haven't lost your job, then, you're not meeting face to face with your colleagues, having a coffee and a chat or talking about work. It could be for many people that virtual interaction just doesn't cut it. It's not the same. And I could absolutely imagine that that's the case.
I think the lockdown's been a great exposure of things like this. I think both the gender disparities in general and loneliness specifically, they were both obviously issues before lockdown began, but they're just being highlighted now. And I think loneliness especially, that felt to me like something that was about to be a bigger topic than it was. We were hearing a lot more about the elderly being lonely, but there's both of these articles and that huge number of people, the 2.6 million people who said that they often or always felt lonely, which was even before the pandemic. There's obviously this huge problem here that we haven't really been, or I certainly haven't been paying attention to up until this point. And it becomes a little bit more pertinent when I suppose everyone's feeling little bits of it. I'm not a massively sociable person, but I don't get the opportunities now that I had before to go out and see people. And it's just me where I'm renting at the moment. So it does bite a little bit, but ultimately I'm okay. And I imagine for people who already felt somewhat lonely beforehand, just to turning the screws on it a bit.
Totally. So that's it for today. If there is anything that you'd like to share on this topic, be it more information around the subject of loneliness or personal story or someone that we would love to hear it. wfh@lowerstreet.co is our email. But the next episode will be slightly less focused on the negative and the bad facts about loneliness and actually some potential fixes and ways that we can respond to it to deal with loneliness during lockdown better. So that episode's coming out on Friday, so be sure to listen then. And until then, do subscribe for more episodes every weekday.